The emergency klaxon screamed through the belly of the C-130 Hercules at 37,000 feet, but Lieutenant Commander Avery "Ghost" Thorne didn't flinch. She'd been asleep in row 10, her weathered flight jacket pulled over her eyes, when the aircraft lurched violently to starboard. Around her, 42 Navy SEALs grabbed their gear as red lights bathed the cargo bay in hellish crimson. "Engine 3 is gone," shouted the loadmaster over the shrieking wind that had begun pouring through a hull breach. "We're losing altitude fast." Captain Marcus "Bulldog" Rodriguez, the SEAL team leader, unbuckled himself and moved forward against the tilting deck. His weathered face was grim as he surveyed the situation. The primary aircrew was either unconscious or worse. The pilot slumped forward over his controls, blood streaming from his forehead where shrapnel had found its mark. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez muttered, then raised his voice above the chaos. "Any pilot left standing?" The SEALs looked around desperately. These were America's elite warriors, men who could infiltrate enemy territory and eliminate high-value targets in their sleep, but none of them could fly a crippled Hercules through a thunderstorm over the Hindu Kush Mountains. The aircraft shuddered again, and through the small windows, they could see jagged peaks reaching up like skeletal fingers in the moonlight. That's when Ghost stood up. At 5'6" with prematurely gray hair and tired hazel eyes, she didn't look like salvation. She looked like someone who'd been passed over for promotion one too many times, someone who'd been relegated to transport duty while her male contemporaries flew F-18 Super Hornets off carrier decks. The SEALs had barely noticed her during the pre-flight briefing in Kandahar. She was just another face in flight suits, another piece of military machinery designed to get them from point A to point B. "I can fly her," Ghost said quietly, her voice barely audible over the screaming engines. Rodriguez squinted at her through the red emergency lighting. "Your cargo transport." "I'm a pilot." She was already moving forward, her hands steady despite the aircraft's violent shaking. "Naval Test Pilot School, class of 2018. 4,000 hours in everything from Cessnas to Ospreys." The hull groaned ominously, and the altimeter was spinning downward like a broken clock. They had maybe 3 minutes before the mountains claimed them all. Rodriguez made the call that would change everything. "She's got the stick. Everyone strap in and pray to whatever God you believe in." Ghost slipped into the pilot's seat, her fingers already dancing across controls that most people couldn't even identify, and began the fight of her life. The mountains of Afghanistan had swallowed countless aircraft before. Tonight, they would learn why some pilots earned the call sign Ghost. Because when death came calling, she simply refused to be there. Ghost's hands moved across the instrument panel with surgical precision, her muscle memory taking over as she assessed the damage. Engine 3 was completely dead, trailing black smoke that she could see in her peripheral vision. Engine 2 was running rough, its RPM gauge fluctuating wildly. The hydraulics were compromised, making the controls feel like they were moving through molasses. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Cargo 77, she transmitted over the emergency frequency. "We have multiple engine failure and are declaring an emergency. Current position approximately 40 miles northeast of Bagram, altitude descending through 28,000 feet. Static answered her. The radio tower at Bagram was either too far away or the storm was interfering with communications. They were alone in the sky, a dying aircraft carrying 43 souls through a maze of 10,000-foot peaks. Behind her, the SEALs had gone quiet. These were men who'd parachuted into enemy territory, who'd walked through firefights like other people walk through rain, but watching a small woman wrestle with a dying aircraft had sobered them completely. They understood weapons, tactics, urban warfare, but this was aviation wizardry, and they were passengers on someone else's magic carpet ride. "Talk to me, Ghost," Captain Rodriguez said, strapping himself into the crew chief's seat. He'd moved up to be closer to the action, unable to sit helplessly in the cargo bay while someone else controlled their fate. "Losing altitude at about 800 feet per minute," Ghost replied, her voice steady as granite. "I'm trying to restart Engine 3, but if I can't get it back online, we're going to have to find somewhere to put her down." Rodriguez looked out the window at the moonlit landscape rushing past below. Mountains, valleys, more mountains, an endless sea of rock and snow that had no forgiveness for aviation mistakes. What about Bagram? "Too far, we'll never make it." Ghost's hands never stopped moving, adjusting trim tabs, redistributing fuel, coaxing every ounce of performance from the remaining engines. "I need to find us a valley, somewhere with enough flat ground for an emergency landing." The aircraft bucked again, and several of the SEALs exchanged glances. They'd survived firefights in Fallujah, raids in Somalia, counterterrorism operations across 3 continents. But this was different. This was physics and gravity, and the simple fact that without lift, 40 tons of aircraft and cargo would become one with the Afghan landscape at roughly 200 miles per hour. Ghost had been fighting these same physics for 12 years, ever since she'd graduated from flight school and discovered that being a woman in military aviation meant proving yourself every single day. She'd logged hours in helicopters over Iraq, transport missions across the Pacific, test flights of experimental aircraft that would have terrified seasoned pilots. Now, with the Hindu Kush mountains reaching up toward them like grasping claws, she was about to face the ultimate test of everything she'd learned. The needle on the altimeter continued its relentless spiral downward. 26,000 feet, 25,000. They were running out of sky, and the mountains were getting closer. Ghost keyed her radio one more time. Any station, this is Cargo 77 with 43 souls on board. We are going down." Ghost's eyes swept across the terrain ahead, searching for salvation in a landscape designed by God to kill aviators. The moonlight revealed a patchwork of valleys and ridgelines, some barely wide enough for a helicopter, others filled with boulders that would turn their aircraft into confetti. She needed something smooth, something long, something that wouldn't turn her passengers into casualties. "There," she said, banking slightly to the left. "Valley at our 11 o'clock. Looks like it might have been a riverbed once." Captain Rodriguez squinted through the windscreen, trying to see what she was seeing. To him, it looked like a shadow between 2 mountain ridges, no different from dozens of others they'd passed. But Ghost was already committing to the approach, her hands steady on the yoke as she began their final descent. "Listen up, gentlemen," she called back to the cargo bay without taking her eyes off the approaching valley. "This is going to be what we call a hard landing. Make sure everything is secured, make sure your gear is tied down, and make sure you're strapped in tight. We're about to find out if this old bird has one more miracle left in her." The SEALs, men who'd fast-roped from helicopters into hostile territory and breached doors under enemy fire, followed her instructions without question. There was something in her voice, not panic, not fear, but the kind of focused calm that comes from accepting a situation and dealing with it professionally. They'd heard that tone in their own voices during firefights, and they recognized competence when they heard it. Engine 2 began coughing, its RPM gauge dancing erratically as fuel starvation started to take its toll. Ghost compensated by adjusting her glide path, trading altitude for airspeed, keeping the aircraft in a controlled descent rather than letting it drop like a stone. "Altitude 2,000 feet above valley floor," she reported. "Still have partial power on engines 1 and 4. Gear up for belly landing. The landing gear won't survive this anyway." The valley was rushing up to meet them now, and Ghost could see details that had been invisible from higher altitude. Rocky outcroppings, scattered boulders, patches of scrub vegetation that indicated slightly softer ground. She picked her touchdown point with the precision of a surgeon selecting an incision site. 500 feet, she called out. "Everyone brace for impact." The Hercules descended through the valley walls like a wounded bird, its remaining engines straining to keep them airborne for just a few more seconds. Ghost had flown this approach 1,000 times in her mind during training, but never with a cargo hold full of special operations warriors, and never with 2 engines dead. The ground rushed up to meet them, and in the final seconds before impact, Ghost pulled back on the yoke with everything she had, flaring the aircraft to bleed off as much speed as possible. The Hercules hit the valley floor with a grinding crash that sent sparks flying from the rocky ground. But they were down, they were alive, and the aircraft was sliding to a stop rather than cartwheeling into oblivion. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the distant whistle of wind through the mountains, 42 Navy SEALs sat in stunned silence. They were alive. Against all odds, they were alive. Ghost sat back in the pilot's seat and finally allowed herself to exhale. Steam rose from the wreckage of the Hercules as Ghost ran through her post-crash checklist with methodical precision. She shut down the remaining engines, secured the fuel systems, and activated the emergency locator beacon before finally unbuckling her harness. Behind her, the SEALs were already moving with practiced efficiency, checking for injuries and securing their equipment. "Sound off," Captain Rodriguez commanded, and one by one his men reported their status. Miraculously, there were no serious injuries, a few bumps and bruises, one possible concussion, but nothing that would prevent them from moving if they needed to. "Outstanding flying, Ghost," Rodriguez said, extending his hand to help her out of the pilot's seat. For the first time since the emergency began, she looked tired. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the reality of their situation was setting in. "Just doing my job, Captain," she replied. But there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before, not pride exactly, but a quiet satisfaction that came from proving herself when it mattered most. The loadmaster, Staff Sergeant Tommy Wrench Kowalski, had survived the crash with nothing more than a cut on his forehead, and he was already assessing their supplies. "We've got MREs for about a week, plenty of water, and enough cold weather gear for everyone. Medical supplies are intact, and most of the communications equipment survived the landing." Ghost moved to one of the small windows and looked out at the moonlit valley that had become their temporary home. They were alive, but they were also stranded in one of the most remote and hostile regions on Earth, surrounded by Taliban-controlled territory and at least 50 miles from the nearest friendly forces. "First priority is getting a message out," she said. "The emergency beacon will help search and rescue find us, but we need to establish communications with Bagram and let them know our status." One of the younger SEALs, Petty Officer Jake Morrison, looked up from where he was checking their radio equipment. "Ma'am, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but our long-range comms took a hit during the crash. I can probably get the short-range tactical radio working, but we're not reaching anybody outside of maybe a 5-mile radius." Ghost nodded, her mind already shifting from pilot mode to survival mode. She'd been through SEER training, survival, evasion, resistance, escape, just like every other military aviator, but she'd never expected to use those skills in the mountains of Afghanistan with a squad of Navy SEALs. "How long before they start looking for us?" asked Sergeant First Class David Tank Williams, a massive man whose call sign was self-explanatory. "We were supposed to check in with Bagram 2 hours after takeoff," Ghost replied. "When we don't make contact, they'll start search and rescue operations, but in this terrain, with this weather." She gestured toward the storm clouds that were still rolling through the mountain peaks. "Could be days before they can get aircraft in the air to look for us." The reality of their situation was sinking in. They were 43 military personnel stranded in enemy territory, with limited supplies and no immediate prospect of rescue. But as Ghost looked around at the faces of the men surrounding her, she saw something that gave her hope. These weren't just any soldiers. These were Navy SEALs, men trained to operate in the most challenging environments on Earth. And now, for the first time in her career, she wasn't just the pilot who got them from one place to another. She was part of the team. Captain Rodriguez was already thinking tactically. We need to set up a defensive perimeter and establish watch rotations. This valley might look empty, but we're deep in Indian country, and sound carries in these mountains. Every Taliban fighter within 20 miles probably heard us come down. Ghost checked her watch. It was just past midnight local time, which meant they had maybe 6 hours of darkness left to prepare their position before daylight would make them visible to anyone with binoculars and hostile intentions. The crashed Hercules would provide some shelter, but it was also a beacon that would draw unwanted attention. "I'll take first watch," she volunteered, but Captain Rodriguez shook his head. "Negative, Ghost. You just saved all our lives. You get some rest while my boys and I figure out how to keep us alive until the cavalry arrives." For the first time since she'd put on a military uniform, Ghost felt like she was truly part of a team rather than just a support asset. It was a strange feeling, but not an unwelcome one. Outside, the Afghan wind whistled through the valley, carrying with it the promise of challenges yet to come. Dawn broke over the valley like a slow-motion explosion, painting the surrounding peaks in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Ghost had managed maybe 2 hours of sleep, curled up in the crew rest area of the wreckage, but she'd been awakened by the sound of voices and the smell of coffee. The SEALs had been busy during the night. They'd established a defensive perimeter around the crash site, positioned sentries on the high ground at both ends of the valley, and somehow managed to get a small camp stove working to brew coffee from their emergency rations. The transformation from passengers to operators had been seamless and professional. "Good morning, Sunshine," called out Petty Officer Morrison, who had apparently appointed himself the team's unofficial morale officer. "Coffee's hot and the Taliban haven't killed us yet, so I'd call that a win." Ghost accepted a steaming metal cup gratefully. The coffee was standard military issue, strong enough to dissolve paint and twice as bitter, but it was warm and caffeinated, which made it perfect for their current situation. Captain Rodriguez approached, carrying his own cup and wearing the expression of a man who'd been thinking strategically since before sunrise. "We need to talk about our options, Ghost. I've got Morrison working on the radio, but even if he gets it functioning, we're still looking at minimum 48 hours before any rescue operation can reach us." Ghost nodded, sipping her coffee while she studied the map Rodriguez had spread out on the wing of the aircraft. Their position was marked with a red X in a sea of brown contour lines that represented some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet. "What's our tactical situation?" she asked. "Could be better, could be worse," Rodriguez replied with the kind of professional understatement that military personnel used when describing situations that civilian would consider hopeless. "We're in a valley that's not on any major transit routes, which means we're unlikely to stumble into a Taliban patrol by accident. But we're also about 15 miles from a known insurgent stronghold, and that Hercules isn't exactly subtle." As if to emphasize his point, the morning sun reflected off the aircraft's aluminum skin, creating a signal that could probably be seen from the International Space Station. Sergeant Williams, who had been examining the wreckage with the thoroughness of a crash investigator, rejoined the group. "Good news and bad news, Captain. Good news is that we've got enough salvageable equipment to keep us alive for about a week. Bad news is that this bird isn't flying anywhere ever again. Whatever hit us didn't just take out the engines. We've got structural damage that would require a complete rebuild." Ghost had already reached the same conclusion, but hearing it confirmed still stung. She'd been flying for 12 years, and she'd never lost an aircraft before. The Hercules had been a good bird, reliable and steady, and she'd brought it down as gently as possible under impossible circumstances. "Not your fault, Ghost," Rodriguez said, reading her expression. You saved 43 lives last night. That aircraft was already dead when you took the controls. You just convinced it to wait until we found a safe place to crash." The radio crackled to life, and Morrison's voice carried across the valley with barely contained excitement. "Captain, I've got something." They rushed over to where Morrison had set up his communications equipment, using the aircraft's emergency power supply to boost the signal. The young petty officer was wearing headphones and adjusting frequency dials with the concentration of a safecracker. "It's not much," Morrison said, "but I'm picking up radio chatter from what sounds like a coalition patrol. There may be 10 miles southeast of here, moving through the next valley over." Rodriguez grabbed the microphone. Any station, this is SEAL Team 7. We have 43 personnel stranded at grid coordinates." He rattled off their position with military precision. The response came back immediately, crackling with static but unmistakably American. "SEAL Team 7, this is Ranger 16. We copy your transmission and are marking your position. Be advised, we cannot reach your location due to hostile activity in the area, but we are relaying your coordinates to higher command." Ghost felt a surge of hope. They weren't forgotten. Somewhere out there, the machinery of military rescue operations was already grinding into motion. By mid-morning, the temperature in the valley had climbed into the 70s, and the SEALs had shed their cold-weather gear in favor of their standard combat uniforms. Ghost had traded her flight suit for a borrowed set of woodland camouflage that was several sizes too large, but it was practical, and it helped her blend in with the team rather than standing out as aircrew. She'd volunteered to take a watch position on the eastern ridge, partly because she wanted to contribute to their security, and partly because she needed some time alone to process everything that had happened. The view from the ridge was spectacular, an endless sea of mountain peaks stretching to the horizon, painted in browns and grays and touched with snow at the higher elevations. It was also tactically sound. From this position, she could observe the approaches to their valley and provide early warning if hostile forces tried to investigate the crash site. Captain Rodriguez had given her a pair of military binoculars and a handheld radio, and she'd positioned herself behind a cluster of boulders that provided both concealment and a clear field of view. The radio crackled with periodic check-ins from the other sentries, and updates from Morrison on his attempts to establish better communications. The SEALs operated with a level of professionalism that impressed Ghost. No unnecessary chatter, no complaints about their situation, just focused attention on the mission of staying alive and awaiting extraction. Around noon, she spotted movement on a distant ridgeline. At first, it was just a flash of reflected sunlight, but as she focused the binoculars, she could make out the shapes of several men moving along what appeared to be a goat trail. They were too far away to determine if they were hostile, but they were definitely armed and they were moving in the general direction of the crash site. "Overwatch to base," she transmitted quietly. "I have movement on the northern ridge, approximately 3 kilometers out. Multiple individuals appears to be armed." Rodriguez's response was immediate. "Copy, Overwatch. Keep eyes on and report any changes in their direction or activity." Ghost settled in behind her binoculars and began the patient work of surveillance. She counted at least 6 individuals, all carrying what appeared to be AK-47 assault rifles. They moved with the casual confidence of people who knew the terrain well, stopping occasionally to rest or survey the surrounding area. After about an hour of observation, the group changed direction, heading away from the valley and disappearing behind an intervening ridge. Ghost continued to watch for another 30 minutes, but they didn't reappear. "Overwatch to base," she reported. "Unknown personnel have moved out of visual contact, last seen heading northeast. Recommend we maintain heightened alert status." "Roger that, Overwatch. Good work." As afternoon shadows began to stretch across the valley floor, Ghost found herself thinking about the irony of her situation. For 12 years, She'd been fighting for respect in an organization that seemed determined to see her as a support asset rather than a warrior. She'd logged thousands of hours in some of the most challenging flying conditions on Earth, but she'd always been evaluated based on how well she performed her assigned role rather than her potential for broader contributions. Now, stranded in enemy territory with a team of elite special operations personnel, she was finally being treated as an equal member of the team. It had taken a plane crash in Afghanistan to prove what she'd known all along, that she was more than just a pilot. The radio interrupted her thoughts. "All stations, this is base. We've got incoming weather from the west. Looks like we're in for another storm tonight." Ghost looked toward the western peaks and could see the wall of dark clouds building on the horizon. In a few hours, they'd be dealing with rain, possibly snow, and winds that would make any rescue operation impossible. It was going to be a long night. The storm hit just after sunset with the fury of nature unleashed. Rain lashed the valley in sheets driven by winds that howled through the mountain passes like something alive and angry. The SEALs had prepared as well as possible, using salvaged materials from the aircraft to create windbreaks and improve their shelter. But there was only so much they could do against the raw power of an Afghan mountain storm. Ghost huddled inside the partially intact crew compartment of the Hercules, sharing space with Captain Rodriguez and two other SEALs. The metal hull provided some protection from the wind and rain, but it also amplified every sound: the ping of hail against aluminum, the groan of stressed metal, the constant whistle of wind through gaps in the damaged structure. "At least the weather will keep any Taliban patrols under cover," Rodriguez observed, raising his voice to be heard over the storm. "Nobody's going to be moving around in this mess." Petty Officer Morrison, who had been trying to maintain radio contact with the outside world, looked up from his equipment with a frustrated expression. "The storm is playing hell with communications, Captain. I can't raise anybody on any frequency." Ghost checked her watch. It was just past 9 p.m. local time, which meant they'd been on the ground for almost 24 hours. Somewhere in the military bureaucracy, search and rescue planners were undoubtedly working on options for extracting them, but the weather was making their job exponentially more difficult. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the valley in stark black and white for a split second before plunging it back into darkness. The thunder that followed seemed to shake the mountains themselves, and Ghost could hear rocks and debris being blown around by the wind. "Hell of a thing," muttered Sergeant Williams, who was sitting across from Ghost and methodically cleaning his M4 carbine despite the fact that it was already spotless. "Here we are, some of the most highly trained military personnel in the world, and we're stuck waiting for Mother Nature to decide whether we live or die." "Could be worse," replied Staff Sergeant Kowalski, the loadmaster. "We could be out there in it instead of in here complaining about it." Ghost found herself studying the faces of the men around her. These were warriors who had faced enemy fire in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, but the storm had imposed a kind of enforced intimacy that was different from combat. They were just people now, sharing stories and bad coffee while waiting for the weather to pass. "Ghost," Captain Rodriguez said, "I've been meaning to ask how'd you get your call sign." It was a question she'd been expecting, and she'd been dreading it at the same time. Every military aviator had a call sign story, and most of them were either embarrassing or classified or both. Hers was neither, but it was personal in a way that she didn't usually share with people she'd just met. "It's not what you think," she said. "Most people assume it's because I'm quiet or because I can sneak up on people, but it actually comes from my first deployment, flying transport missions in Iraq. I had a habit of showing up at forward operating bases that had been told they weren't getting any supply runs that day." She paused, listening to the storm rage outside. There was one particular FOB fire base delta that had been cut off for about a week. They were running low on everything: food, water, ammunition, medical supplies. The weather had been terrible, and several aircraft had been turned back due to sandstorms and hostile fire. Lightning flashed again, and in its brief illumination, Ghost could see that she had everyone's complete attention. I managed to thread the needle, got through the weather and the surface-to-air missiles, and delivered their supplies. When I landed, the base commander came out to meet me. He took one look at my aircraft and said, "I don't know how you made it through that hell, but you flew through it like a ghost." The thunder rolled across the valley, and Ghost smiled slightly. The name stuck. Every time there was a mission that seemed impossible, every time the weather was too bad or the enemy fire was too heavy, they'd call Ghost. I guess I developed a reputation for showing up when everyone else said it couldn't be done. Captain Rodriguez nodded slowly. That explains a lot about last night. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountains, but inside the damaged Hercules, 43 military personnel settled in for another long night, secure in the knowledge that their pilot had earned her call sign honestly. Dawn of the second day brought clear skies and the distant sound of rotors echoing off the valley walls. Ghost was the first to hear it, her trained ear picking up the distinctive thump-thump-thump of helicopter blades long before anyone else. She grabbed her binoculars and climbed to the highest point she could reach on the wreckage, scanning the horizon for the source of the sound. "Aircraft approaching from the southeast," she called out, and immediately the camp came alive with activity. The SEALs moved with practiced efficiency, some taking defensive positions while others prepared signal devices to identify themselves to the incoming aircraft. "I see them," Ghost announced, focusing her binoculars on two black dots that were growing larger against the morning sky. "Looks like two Black Hawks flying in formation." Captain Rodriguez was on the radio immediately, broadcasting on the emergency frequency. "Any coalition aircraft in the vicinity of Grid 41, SMB 12,345, 67,890. This is SEAL Team 7. We have 43 personnel at this location requesting immediate extraction." The response came back crisp and professional. "SEAL Team 7, this is Dustoff 72. We have you in sight and are inbound for pickup. Be advised, we have limited time on station due to fuel constraints and potential hostile activity in the area." The Black Hawks circled the valley once, their crews undoubtedly assessing the landing zone and looking for signs of enemy presence. Ghost watched through her binoculars as the lead helicopter's door gunner swept his weapon across the surrounding ridgelines while the pilot evaluated their options for touchdown. "Dustoff 72, be advised the large aircraft on the valley floor is friendly wreckage," Rodriguez transmitted. "Landing zone is clear, but recommend you keep your engines running." The first Black Hawk settled into the valley like a giant mechanical insect, its rotor wash kicking up clouds of dust and debris. The second helicopter remained in orbit overhead, providing overwatch while the extraction took place. Ghost had seen hundreds of helicopter operations during her career, but she'd never been so happy to watch one as she was at that moment. The SEALs moved toward the helicopter in groups, carrying their gear and helping the few personnel who had been injured during the crash. Ghost found herself walking beside Captain Rodriguez, both of them instinctively ducking as they approached the spinning rotors. "Age before beauty, Ghost," Rodriguez shouted over the noise of the engines, gesturing for her to board first. Ghost shook her head and pointed toward his men. "Your team, Captain. I'll take the second bird." It was a small gesture, but it meant something. She was crew, and crew always made sure the passengers were safe before worrying about themselves. It was a tradition as old as aviation itself, and even though they were all military personnel and theoretically equals, some traditions were worth maintaining. The first Black Hawk lifted off with 22 passengers aboard, leaving Ghost and the remaining 21 personnel to wait for the second extraction. The wait seemed eternal, maybe 5 minutes in reality, but long enough for Ghost to imagine all the things that could go wrong. enemy fighters appearing on the ridgelines, mechanical problems with the remaining helicopter, orders from higher command to abort the mission due to changing tactical conditions. But then the second Black Hawk was settling into the valley, and Ghost was running toward it with the last group of survivors. As she climbed aboard, she took one final look back at the wreckage of her Hercules, the aircraft that had carried them safely through an impossible situation, before giving its life to save theirs. The helicopter lifted off and banked toward the south, carrying them away from the valley that had been their home for 2 nights and 1 day. Through the window, Ghost watched the mountains of Afghanistan fall away beneath them, and for the first time since the emergency began, she allowed herself to believe that they were really going to make it home. Bagram Tower, this is Dustoff 72 with precious cargo inbound. Request priority landing and immediate medical evaluation for 43 personnel. Dustoff 72, you are cleared for landing pad 7. Medical teams are standing by. They were going home. The debriefing room at Bagram Air Base was sterile and fluorescent lit, the kind of anonymous government space that could have been located anywhere from Afghanistan to Alaska. Ghost sat at a metal table across from Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, the wing commander's representative, while a digital recorder captured every word of their conversation. For the record, Lieutenant Commander Thorne, you are not under investigation, Colonel Hayes began, consulting the thick folder of documents spread out before her. This is a standard post-incident interview to document what happened and identify any lessons learned that might prevent similar occurrences in the future. Ghost nodded, sipping coffee from a paper cup that bore the Bagram Air Base logo. She'd been through debriefings before, though never for anything quite this dramatic. The routine was familiar. State the facts, stick to what you observed directly, avoid speculation or second-guessing. Take me through the sequence of events, starting from when you first became aware of the emergency. Ghost closed her eyes and let her mind return to that moment when the klaxon had awakened her from sleep. I was resting in row 10 of the cargo compartment when the emergency alarm sounded at approximately 23:47 hours local time. The aircraft experienced immediate severe vibration and a rapid loss of altitude. She continued through the timeline methodically, describing her assessment of the damage, the decision to attempt an emergency landing, and the selection of the valley that had ultimately saved their lives. Colonel Hayes took notes and occasionally asked for clarification, but mostly she just listened. The preliminary investigation indicates that your aircraft suffered a catastrophic failure of the No. 3 engine, which resulted in debris impact on the hull and damage to multiple systems, Hayes said. Initial forensics suggest possible maintenance issues with the engine, but the investigation is ongoing. Ghost felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. Vindication because the failure hadn't been caused by pilot error, sadness because a good aircraft had been lost due to something that might have been preventable. I want to read you something, Lieutenant Commander, Hayes continued, pulling a sheet of paper from her folder. This is from the initial report filed by Captain Rodriguez of SEAL Team 7. She cleared her throat and began reading. Lieutenant Commander Thorne demonstrated exceptional airmanship and professionalism under extreme emergency conditions. Her decision-making was sound, her execution was flawless, and her actions directly resulted in the survival of 43 military personnel who would otherwise have been lost. She performed her duties with the highest standards of the United States Navy and brought great credit upon herself and the naval service. Ghost felt heat rise in her cheeks. It wasn't the first commendation she'd received during her career, but somehow this one felt different. It wasn't just acknowledging her technical proficiency or her adherence to procedures. It was recognizing her as a warrior who had faced an impossible situation and won. There's more, Hayes said. Captain Rodriguez has recommended you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. Admiral Morrison has endorsed the recommendation and forwarded it to Washington for approval. the Distinguished Flying Cross. Ghost had seen the medal in ceremonies and read about it in military histories, but she'd never imagined receiving one herself. It was awarded for extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight, and recipients included some of the greatest pilots in military history. "I was just doing my job, ma'am," Ghost said, falling back on the standard military response to praise. "No, Lieutenant Commander, you were doing everyone's job," Hayes replied. "The pilot's job, the co-pilot's job, the navigator's job, and about 6 other specialties that don't normally fall under the purview of a single person. You saved 43 lives with nothing but skill, determination, and a refusal to give up." There was a knock on the door, and a yeoman entered carrying a message form. Hayes read it quickly, then looked up at Ghost with something that might have been a smile. "Lieutenant Commander, it seems that Admiral Morrison would like to see you in his office at your earliest convenience. Something about a new assignment that might be of interest to you." Ghost stood up, straightened her uniform, and prepared to find out what the future held for a pilot who had earned her call sign by refusing to accept the impossible. The walk to Admiral Morrison's office took Ghost through the heart of Bagram Air Base, past hangars filled with aircraft from a dozen different nations and flight lines where pilots and crews prepared for missions across Afghanistan and beyond. It was a world she knew well, but somehow it looked different now. She was seeing it.